Hi, everyone. My name is Kevin Kim Wright, and it's my privilege and pleasure to be with you all today. The reading that I'm basing my sermon off of is from the book of Acts, chapter 9, beginning with the first verse and going through verse 6. Let me read it for you. Meanwhile, Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any who belonged to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now, as he was going along and approaching Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" He asked, "Who are you, Lord?" The reply came, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But get up and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do." I am a die-hard Parks and Rec fan. For those of you who aren't familiar, Parks and Rec was a show that ran on NBC many years ago, starring Amy Poehler as Leslie Knope, the deputy director of a small Indiana town's Park and Rec department. The town was called Pawnee, completely fictitious. And in this role, Amy Poehler played this character, Leslie Knope, who you simultaneously were rooting for and also deeply annoyed by. You were rooting for her because she was likable, she was kind, she was deeply loyal and devoted to everyone around her. You were also annoyed by her because she was very excitable, very exuberant, always on top of things, and gave things 150% even when they didn't need to be. Binders were always color-coded. Projects were carefully diagrammed out. She would be on top of everything in a way that you were both appreciative for, but also a little annoyed by. It's kind of like when I worked in churches, I would always get annoyed by the people who worked in children's ministry. God bless them, right? They have the hardest job in the church and arguably the most important job. They have to work with kids, which requires having a lot of energy, always being on. And then they would come into staff meeting and they would bring that same level of energy and everything would be so super exciting and so super great. And I'd be like, "You are at a 10 and I need you to be at like a 5 or like a 6. And I would joke with one of my colleagues, I just need you to be a little bit more jaded. Jaded, right? We all can be jaded at times. Some of us don't have any problem with that at all because when it comes to Christianity, when it comes to religion, when it comes to the types of systemic oppression and racism that we as Asian American Christians encounter in the United States, it can be very easy to become jaded. Many of us are on these faith journeys where we find ourselves confronting some of the harsh truths about what westernized Christianity right here in the United States of America has wrought, not just upon the general population, but also upon ourselves as individuals and as a community. We've seen American Christianity power racism in this country, power entire systems of oppression that keep down our siblings, black and brown, indigenous, transgender, queer. We've seen American Christianity do terrible things in terms of wreaking havoc on the environment and supporting policies that are antithetical to the commandment that God gives us to care for creation. We've seen American Christianity start to make these obscene pronouncements on what women can and cannot do with their bodies and access the type of healthcare that they need and rightly should be able to access. And when all of these things happen, it's no wonder that we might take a look at Christianity and say, you know what, the version that I'm seeing out there, it's not quite for me. And we might get a little jaded by it. And there are a lot of people who feel this way, and that's why there's this whole movement towards deconstruction. Deconstruction is a real thing. It's a time, it's a season when we unlearn, when we reprocess, when we work through a lot of this tough stuff, a lot of the trauma that has been put onto us as a result of the way that Christianity in this country has manifested itself and unfortunately evolved. Now, it'd be really easy and slightly dismissive to say, well, that's not really Christianity, that's just something else. But the reality is that in saying that, we're refusing to acknowledge the fact that Christians are imperfect people and that throughout the history of Christianity, the people of God have always been led astray. Look at the Old Testament. You have the Israelites constantly going astray and worshiping the gods of their neighbors, the Philistines, or the Phoenicians, or the Moabites. And yet, they're still the people of God. They are still the people that God's heart breaks for. So much in the same way, we might try to distance ourselves from the way that Christianity exists in this country, and yet at the same time, it's just not that easy. And so what we try to do then is we try to deconstruct it. We try to say, well, that may be where we're at, but that's not where we are right now. And so we began to dismantle. We say, well, this aspect of Christianity that's all about excluding queer people, we're not about that. And, this part of Christianity that said I have to believe these things in order to fit in, I'm not really about that. And we start to deconstruct, and dare I say, sometimes we even get a little jaded. Well, here's the thing about deconstruction. It's a process, right? And in many ways, I hate to say it, there's not any one right or wrong way to do it. The process looks different for every single person. But one thing I've noticed through this process is that sometimes we who grew up in religious settings, perhaps, when we think back 10 years ago, 15 years ago, if you're that old, when you first became a Christian, or if you grew up in a church, you might have gone through a season where you were really, really zealous and you were really, really on fire. That was my story. My father is a minister in an evangelical denomination, retired now. And so I grew up going to church, and I knew every single Bible verse. If you had, a sword drill or a Bible drill, that's where you have your Bible and they'll throw out like a random verse, like Ruth chapter 2, verse 3. Whoever can get there first is the winner. And the kids who had like the little tabs on their Bible that that showed you where like these obscure books were, like Habakkuk or parts of Malachi, like those were cheaters. Those kids were cheating, clearly. But for the rest of us, we could get to those verses pretty quickly. And I could spurt off Bible story after Bible story. And I went to these conferences where I was all about trying to, learn how to witness to people and hand out tracts on the street. I was really, really on fire. And there were many people like me. That's very similar to a lot of other people's experience. And one of the things that I've noticed is that people who go from being very, very zealous about a particular type of Christianity can also go to being very, very zealous about a different type of Christianity or faith expression or whatever you call it. And so the people who are the loudest and take up the most space when it comes to Westernized Christianity can also take up the most space and have the loudest voice when it comes to the process of deconstruction and reformulation, if that's the journey that people want to go down. It's easy to get overly zealous. We do this all the time, right? You try out a restaurant and you really like it, and you tell all your friends, oh my gosh, you have to try this restaurant out. Or how many of us have had someone say like, just rub this essential oil on you and your muscles are going to feel so much better. And maybe they do, but like also I don't need you to keep shoving essential oils under my nose and having me sniff them every 5 minutes. Skincare products or different type of clothing, it doesn't matter. We find something that we like, we become passionate about it, and then we become a huge evangelist for it. And the reality is, we can do that with both the faith that we left and also the type of faith or expression of faith or semblance of faith that we currently now inhabit. Here's what I mean. We all want to be free. We all want to be people who are liberated by the power of God. We're all leaving places and systems of oppression. And like the story that we read today from the book of Acts, we're like Saul, and we might have been going down in one direction, and then all of a sudden something happened where our entire mindset, our entire viewpoint radically changed. For Saul, he literally became blind. For some of us, we enter into this phase where things look a little less clear than they used to, right? As we move from this sphere of absolute certainty, and I know every verse in the Bible, and I can recite every single creed and catechism, to this place of it's a little less shaky of what I believe. And instead of seeing bright, sharp colors, I perhaps see more shadows. Well, when we move into that place, we're like Saul. We get knocked off our horse a little bit. And for Saul, it was great that he got knocked off his horse, because he was doing some pretty evil stuff. When he was on that horse, he was getting ready to go arrest men and women and throw them into prison. But what is it that Jesus says to Saul when he's knocked off? He says, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Why are you persecuting me? We have a lot of instances on social media, on Twitter, on different forums for conversation, where sometimes if you don't quite do things the right way when it comes to faith reformulation or faith deconstruction, then you kind of get othered and get seen as an outcast. And what's really tragic about this is that a lot of us have tried to find our way out of these systems where every I had to be dotted and every T had to be crossed in one particular way. And here's the creed, and if you don't believe every single word verbatim, if you don't believe every single word in this Bible is literally true, then you're not really a Christian, and you'll be cast out. And then we move into this phase where things are a little more gray. And then we might hear voices again saying, well, if you don't deconstruct in exactly this way, and if you don't end up exactly at this point, then you didn't deconstruct properly. And now you're just as, you might as well go back to be with the fundamentalists that you came from. And neither of those views are right. Because in both cases, the person saying that to us, and sometimes it's us saying it to other people, we're still riding on that horse on the way to Damascus, getting ready to throw people into jail. We need to be knocked off and to be told to stop persecuting other people. Paul certainly had blind spots, right? Even after he was knocked off the horse, and of course, as the story goes on, he's blind, and a prophet, Ananias, has to come and have Saul receive his sight again. But even after that, Saul, now Paul, goes off and does his own studies, has some mystical experiences, and he's still making mistakes, right? Still saying things about women that were kind of like, now, still has blind spots when it comes to slaves. Sorry, Onesimus. And in each of these instances, it's a reminder to us that no matter how many times we've been knocked off the horse, we still have this temptation to climb back on it. We still have this temptation to get into a seat of power. Now, one of the things that I'm most concerned about is when you look at a lot of folks who are leading conversations in both in spheres of progressive Christianity, authors or whatnot, or thought leaders, as you might call them. Just a couple years ago, they were kind of leading the charge when it came to the most evangelical of causes. And so a lot of the people that were publishing books that were bestsellers in family Christian bookstores, 10 or 15 years ago, they're now the people that have the podcast or have the Twitter accounts that are now telling you how to live a different type of Christianity. And what I'm wondering is, what does it look like to get knocked off the horse and then to stay off of it? To be in that position where you are listening to the words of God say, just listen for a little bit. Listen to what this looks like. Listen to what this feels like. Listen to an entire new method of faith, what that might sound like. Paul took 3 years in the wilderness after he was knocked off the horse and received his sight back. He still didn't get everything right. And yet we're so eager that once we get into this realm of deconstruction, to be like, we got this mastered, we got this figured out, I know how to do this, and then we try to force that upon other people and become just as exclusionary as the place that we left. I see this happen sometimes in queer spaces. As a queer person myself, I see people many times say there is one way to live a queer life and one way that you have to come out. And when you come out, it needs to be to everyone, and you need to be big and you need to be bold about it and you need to tell everyone around you. And I meet some people who say, like, I don't know if I can do that yet. I don't know for reasons of legitimate safety concern if that's right for me. But then they begin to feel shamed by people around them who say, if you're not out to every single person in your life, you're not out at all. And I don't think it works that way. I always tell folks it's your story. You get to tell it how you want to tell it and to whom you want to tell it. I think that's similar to what's going on today. Is that when we enter on this process of questioning and reshaping our faith, and trying to find out expressions of our faith that are not based in systems of oppression or in problematic understandings of our place in the world, I think the temptation can be is that we become overly zealous to say, like, yeah, we were on one hand, we used to be the person who could win every sword drill and recite every Bible verse, and now we're the person who knows absolutely everything about deconstruction. I don't think it works that way. I think instead we need to find, by the grace of God, the space to sit in the gray, to recognize that the journey of faith that we're on is one that we are doing both as an individual and as a community of people around us. It's our story. We get to tell it how we want to tell it and in the ways that we want to tell it. One of the things that I'm most moved by in recent years in my work is I get to work with young people who are trying to get into college from high school. And although the organization I work for isn't explicitly faith-based, we are not a faith-based organization, sometimes that does not preclude in any way, shape, or form very significant and very raw conversations from happening. In fact, I always tell people, I have more experience now as a youth pastor than when I ever worked in the church. And sometimes the students will come up and they'll talk to me and they'll be like, I have all these expectations put on me by my teachers, by my guidance counselors, by my parents, and I feel like I have to be so many things, and really I don't know who or what I should be. And I always say this: what is it that you want to be? That you want to be, not that what anyone else wants to do. What is it that you feel like you want to do? What does that inner voice tell you to do? And whenever I say that, it's kind of this amazing look of wonderment and relief that washes over their faces, because they realize that everyone else can be shouting at them what it looks like to have a successful career, but in all reality, what that student desires to do, that's what ultimately matters, and they get to define what success looks like for them. For us, as a people of God, trying to figure out our way through this world and our way through a country in which Christianity has been expressed in some really perverted and twisted ways, it can be really easy to jump on over from side to side to side and have this mindset of we're always going to get it right, and we always have to be perfect, and we always have to have things figured out. And the reality is that's just not true. Jesus makes it really simple. Love God and love the people around you, and you'll figure it out from there. That sounds pretty good to me. Let's stay off the horse for a little while longer. Amen.